an apology for the Septuagint, in which its claims to be biblical and canonical authority are briefly stated and vindicated, by E. W. Greenfield, M.A., editor of the Hellenistic Greek Testament, 1850. And it has something here in Latin. Introduction. This apology may be regarded as a natural sequel to the author's Hellenistic edition of the Greek Testament. Whilst acting as an editor, the author felt it his duty to abstain strictly from all general and argumentative reasoning, trusting solely to the value and amount of the copious materials compiled in the LXX. The author never presumed to interpose any comments or observations of his own. Whatever of comment or illustration may be found in that edition is always stated in the words and language of others. But the time had arrived when the author felt he should venture to break silence and give vent to thoughts which had been long brooding with him. After such a long and continuous study of the Septuagint, it was natural that he should have come to some clear and definite conclusion concerning its scriptural and canonical authority. It was not a conclusion formed hastily, nor did it result from any previous conviction of its universal reception in the primitive church. It crept on from chapter to chapter, and from year to year it grew up with thousands and tens of thousands of incidental resemblances. The author gradually ascertained that almost every quotation in the New Testament was either literally or substantially taken from the LXX, that it was perpetually present to the minds of the evangelists and apostles, nay, that where the author had least expected to find it, the Apocalypse, even there it constituted the entire staple of thought and expression. The inevitable inference that the author could not avoid, that the authenticity of the New Testament is bound up with the authenticity of the Greek version of the Old, that it stands pledged not only for its general truth, or it stood pledged not only for its general truth and historical authenticity, but for its scriptural and canonical authority. The New Testament, the author felt, was not to be treated in this respect like any merely human record. As the immediate offspring of the Divine Spirit, it claims to be so far inspired in its language as to admit of no material mistake or error. By its continual appeal to the Greek version of the LXX, it necessarily raises that version to its own standard. To cite from an uninspired version, thus frequently and statedly, would be to forfeit and annul its own claim to plenary inspiration. This conviction was so impressed on the author's mind that he even had no supplementary evidence, or even if no supplementary evidence had arisen, he would have felt, or should have felt, it his duty to have laid the result before the public. But when he met with some recent publications on the canon at that time, in which the position was not only controverted but treated as if it were monstrous and incredible, he was led to take a calm review of all the ecclesiastical facts belonging to the history of the LXX. The result of that inquiry, the author most respectfully submitted to the judgment of the Christian Church. The results of that inquiry he submitted most respectfully by submitting them to the judgment of the Christian Church. As the materials of this apology were too miscellaneous to admit of the usual formality of a table of contents, he suggested let him request the reader, or made the reader accept the following brief analysis of the argument. First, that this version of the Hebrew Scriptures was made between 2 and 3 centuries before the Christian era, and that no other version existed before that era. Second, that it was made at a period when the Hebrew language had suffered much decay, when it was no longer vernacular in Palestine and had ceased to be understood by Jews of the dispersion. Third, that this version was made by Jews of the dispersion living at Alexandria and composed in that peculiar style of Greek in which the New Testament was subsequently written. Fourth, that it was universally received by the Hellenists or Jews of the dispersion as authoritative and canonical, being publicly used in their synagogues both before and after the Christian era. Fifth, that Jesus was instructed from his childhood in the knowledge of Septuagint, the Hebrew text being altogether unknown in Galilee. Sixth, that all his disciples were Galileans and Hellenists, possessing no knowledge of biblical Hebrew before the miraculous gift of tongues. Seventh, that Christ and the apostles in their references to the Old Testament make their principal citations in the words of the LXX, and occasionally where it differs from the Hebrew text. Eighth, that the believing Hellenist Jews were the first converts to Christianity and constituted the earliest members of the Christian Church. Ninth, that the unbelieving Hellenists continued to use this version till, pressed by authorities drawn from the LXX, they made, around AD 200 to 300, the Jewish version of Aquila, Theodotion, etc. 10th, that the whole Christian Church during the first 4 centuries received this version as canonical and used and read it in public worship. 11th, that all the ancient versions of the Old Testament, with the exception of the Syriac, were made exclusively from the LXX. 12th, that when Jerome made a Latin version from the Hebrew text, around AD 400, which gradually superseded the Septuagintal use of the italic, the change was not understood by the Church as abrogating the previous authority of the LXX, but as combining the original with the version in the canon. 13th, that the Hebrew language was understood by none of the Christian fathers, save Jerome and Origen. These are Roman Catholic Christian fathers. And that study and knowledge continued dormant in the Church till the era of the Reformation. 14th, that the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts have suffered alike in transcription, and that no argument can be raised on that account to abuse or debase the latter or exalt the former. 15th, that the Eastern and Western Church unite in maintaining this conjoint canon of the Old Testament, that the biblical authority of the LXX has not been abrogated amongst Protestants by any authoritative decision. Coroll 1. That the scriptural authority of the Septuagint is attested by this ancient Jewish church and by the writers of the New Testament. Coroll 2. That to deny this authority is to depart from the canon of the primitive church, and thereby to invalidate our appeals to the fathers of the 3 first centuries. Coroll 3. That to deny this authority is to endanger the critical study of the Old Testament and to impair the plenary inspiration of the New. Coroll 4. That the Church of England demands no such denial, adhering to the primitive church by retaining the LXX version of the Psalms in her liturgy and prayer book. And there's a footnote below. A deeply interesting quotation is now within pending, which would seem either to confirm or invalidate this assertion. Should the legislator decide on legalizing the marriage of a deceased wife's sister with her late husband, it will annul the Vatican LXX. Deuteronomy 27:23, it's in the Greek, which has hitherto influenced the whole Western Church, but the entire passage is a gross interpolation introduced probably by Romish canonists to justify the sale of matrimonial dispensations, or to make money from that, probably. See postscript page 191. At the close will be found an appendix containing the principal authorities on which the apology is founded, with such miscellaneous matter as could not conveniently be introduced into the general statement. So it's saying at the end there should be an index with that miscellaneous matter found there. An apology for the Septuagint. The various and conflicting opinions which have so long prevailed amongst Christians concerning this Greek version of the ancient scriptures must render an inquiry into its real rank and importance amongst the most interesting copies of biblical investigation. As the entire phraseology of the New Testament is formed on the peculiar style of the LXX, as all our doctrinal terms are taken from its vocabulary, whilst by far the greater number of its quotations are transferred from its text, it becomes of the utmost moment to decide whether the primitive Christians were right or wrong in their opinions concerning it, and whether we are warranted in maintaining opinions contrary to those which were held by all the Christian fathers, Roman Catholic Church fathers, till the days of Jerome. In all matters of faith and doctrine, as well as of discipline, a temperate appeal to the sentiments of the primitive church of the first 3 centuries has hitherto been regarded as a fair and legitimate mode of inquiry. The value of the writings of Bull, Pearson, Gray, Waterland, Horsley, Lardner, etc. is chiefly to be estimated by such a standard. But on a matter of scriptural and historical fact, like that of the universal reception of the Septuagint version, the usage and authority of the primitive church becomes absolute and paramount. As a member of the Church of England, honestly attached to the Articles and Liturgy, the author did not feel himself called upon to make any apology for this avowal of opinion, and at that time he had yet to learn that he was departing from any decision which she made on the subject of this inquiry. It's probably the Church of England he's talking about. Individuals in her communion have taken different sides in the argument, but these opinions do not affect her ecclesiastical authority. In these matters, said Bishop Burnet on the 6th article, alluding to the differences between the Hebrew and the Septuagint, our church has made no decision, and so divines are left to a just freedom in theirs. This indeed is the last view which can be taken of the question. Considering that the church had retained the use of the Septuagintal Psalms, and that their reformers avowed and expressed a high esteem for the fathers of the 3 first centuries, the author then began to think that a strong inference could be drawn in favour of his general conclusion. Even those who question such an appeal on points of doctrine or discipline can or could scarce refuse it on a question relating to the canon of Scripture. Without resigning their belief in divine superintendence, they could not admit that the universal church could have been mistaken on such a practical and fundamental question. It followed as a plain and unavoidable inference that if this Greek version of the Old Testament, be not of scriptural and canonical authority, the entire Christian church, till the days of Jerome, possessed no authentic or canonical record of the Old Testament. To avoid this painful dilemma, they at once submitted that it is not within the jurisdiction of any national church to reject as uncanonical a version of the Old Testament, which was universally acknowledged as inspired and canonical during the first 4 centuries. This Greek version was received by the immediate successors of the apostles on authority which they could not hesitate to acknowledge. They had heard it preached and quoted by the apostles. They found it more or less in every chapter of the New Testament. They knew it had been the great scaffold of building up the Christian church, and that it had been used and received among the Hellenists for nearly 300 years before the Christian era, or the Greeks, and probably the Hellenist Jews. When 400 years had passed away, could the introduction of Jerome's Latin version from the Hebrew destroy the acknowledged and canonical authority of that Greek version, which had hitherto been universally received as inspired? This new Latin version might plead, and justly plead, its right and authority to supersede the use of the italic or any other Latin version which had been translated from the LXX. But how could it destroy the authority of the original from which such versions were made? Jerome was no prophet, and he never affected to hold a prophetic office or character. He could not abrogate the usage and authority of all who had preceded or come before him. He was in no respect but as an Hebraist, superior to Augustine, either in learning or talent. He was in no respect but as an Hebraist, superior to Augustine, either in learning or talent. He acted wisely and meritoriously in undertaking a Latin version from the Hebrew. He has deserved and received the thanks of the Universal Church, that would be the Roman Catholic Church, for thus demanding its attention and reverence to that divine original from which the Septuagint itself was translated. But this Latin version, however valuable, could not invalidate the previous fact that the Greek version had been de facto canonized as a providential medium of preparing both Jews and Gentiles for the reception of the gospel that had been largely incorporated with the New Testament, ratified by the citations of evangelists and apostles, and sealed with the indelible stamp of ecclesiastical consent of 400 years. And there's a reference to that at the bottom, Grove's Prolegom. Yet it should ever be remembered that the reverence and respect which were paid by ancient fathers, church fathers, to this Greek version implied no disregard of degradation of the Hebrew archetype. They were prevented by providential arrangements from consulting the Hebrew text. They could not read or study a language which, for so many ages, had ceased to be vernacular. But this reverence of the version must always have implied an equal, if not superior, reverence of the original. Ego pro meo modulo, saith Augustine, vestigia secor apostolorum qui ipsi ultra q testimonia posturunt. They believed that for wise and gracious purposes, this Greek version had become to the Gentiles what the original Hebrew had been to the Jews during the first age of the Jewish economy, and consequently that when Jews and Gentiles were brought into the same fold, both the original and the version should be regarded of coordinate authority and forming conjointly the canon of the ancient scriptures. And footnote at the bottom says, look at the appendix number 5. Now this is the basis on which we propose to erect the following inquiry. That's the author talking there. Far from aiming to introduce any novelties of doctrine or opinion, they desired only to assert the same biblical standard as that which belonged to the universal church until the days of Jerome, Roman Catholic Church until the days of Jerome. To expel the Greek version from that rank which it held so long in the primitive church is virtually to change the primitive canon. If they proclaimed that the canon of the Old Testament depended solely on the Hebrew text, whilst they admitted the Greek version to a conjoint alliance, they practically set up their own standard against theirs. They also declared the whole Greek church to hold a false canon. The Greek church still adhered strictly to the usage of the primitive church. The mutilation of canon could never be justified. The Greek church asserted no more than what Augustine and the early church fathers maintained and believed, and they were at full liberty in their public worship to prefer the Hebrew original to the Greek version of the Old Testament, but they had no right to denounce that version as uncanonical. The Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge then dispersed 1,500 copies of the LXX amongst the poor Greek clergy in the Levant, in the Near East. It acted wisely and discreetly and gave a sanction to the principle which they were advocating. The later canonists at that time thought proper to depart from this wise and comprehensive accordance with primitive Christianity, and had thereby thrown insurmountable obstacles in the way of any general ecclesiastical reunion between the Eastern and Western Church. It would be deplorable if the Church of England should indirectly countenance this or that schism. They had hitherto been distinguished for moderation and especially for attachment to the ecclesiastical authority by the fathers of the first centuries, or the church fathers of the Roman Catholic Church of the first 3 centuries. And the author trusted that they would not be thought to differ from them on the fundamental question. But it was vain to disguise the popular feeling amongst many zealous Protestants that the Septuagint version of the Old Testament had no longer any claim to be considered of scriptural authority, that it was superseded by the Hebrew text. Whilst this essential discrepance on the canon continued popular, the author feared that unbelievers would find a plausible ground of attacking the outwork of Christianity. They would naturally object that if they did not refer to the same scriptural record as the primitive church, the Roman Catholic Church, they could not fairly appeal to her authority on any matter relating to the doctrines or facts of the Old Testament. Nor could they, the author began to think, consistently defend the plenary inspiration of the New Testament if they admitted that compromised such a large portion of uninspired material. As most of its quotations are taken from the LXX, the infidel will always object, those who are against it, obviously, the critic, maybe the skeptic, that by their own confession, both Christ and his apostles have founded the appeals to patriarchs and prophets on a version which they asserted to be merely human. And then the writer goes on to say that they were less assailable on the same ground to the attacks of the Roman Church. She may have reasonably affirmed that they abjured the primitive canon by reducing the Greek version to the level of a translation simply human, and they were at liberty, says the author, like the Romanists, to prefer the Hebrew to the LXX in their public worship, but they were not at liberty to renounce and condemn the latter as unscriptural or uncanonical. It sounds repetitive. They were right in condemning Rome on the subject of the Apocrypha, but they were not justified in condemning her for her reverence and veneration of the Septuagint. And she could have justly replied, you not only disregard the authority of the primitive church, but you invalidate the plenary inspiration of the New Testament. And if you object to the, is he talking about the church, that he's corrupted the canon, or the church talking to him, that he's corrupted the canon by the addition of apocryphal matter, they object to you. This one in particular objects to somebody else, that you have invalidated the canon by cutting off one of its coordinate members. It is on such grounds that we, at the time, they most respectfully solicited public attention to a candid and deliberate examination of this momentous subject. And he goes on and on. In defence of every caution, it will be urged, the Septuagint is only a version, and therefore can never be esteemed of the same rank and value as an original. Such is a popular objection, but is not this begging the question at issue? Whenever a version is made by the same authority as the original, it surely becomes of equal force and authority. Thus it is with their own articles, the Latin and the English are both of equivalent authority. If the original Syro-Chaldaic of St. Matthew's Gospel had been then extant, admitting that hypothesis, or out of the picture, not in use, it's gone, long gone, unused, it would not have been superior to the present Greek version. Or if they had the Hebrew archetype of the Jewish wars of Josephus, it would not be of higher value than their Greek translation at the time. And he says that it was generally acknowledged that they didn't have the original words of Jesus or his disciples recorded in the language in which they were spoken. It was scarcely credible that the poor woman who came out of the coast of Tyre and Sidon could have uttered her cries and lamentations in Greek. She spoke the native language of her country. It was Syro-Phoenician or Syro-Chaldaic, and the same mixed language with some variety of dialect prevailed at that time over Judea, Samaria and Galilee. There seems the highest probability that most of the Saviour's conversation with the scribes and Pharisees, and that all his addresses to the common people, were spoken in a vernacular tongue, or that vernacular tongue. But when it was subsequently ordered that the New Testament should be composed in Hellenistic Greek, they were enabled by that divine power which they termed inspiration. These people, these writers, this author termed inspiration, to convert this provincial and transient dialect into its present fixed and enduring form. Now, this kind of inspiration seemed closely analogous, although of a higher grade, to that which the early fathers, church fathers, Roman Catholic church fathers, attributed to the translators of the Septuagint. The first were enabled to translate without any important error the exact meaning of Syro-Chaldaic, words into their present Greek form, or that Greek form. The other were unable to translate their native Hebrew into expressions, which is probably like idioms, which should hereafter be received and accommodated to the Greek of the New Testament, and they should forever speak with much reserve and humility on that mysterious subject. Much of the discredit which attaches to the Septuagint, simply on account of its being a version, would be instantly removed by considering that in no other way than as a canonical version of the Hebrew could it have brought about the great objects for which it was ordained. The Hellenistic Jews, when they ceased to be able to read their native Hebrew, could not have been addressed in any other manner. It was only by a version of the ancient scriptures that they could retain a knowledge of the promises made to their ancestors. And why should that version be deemed of inferior authority if it was designed not only for their personal benefit but to carry forward the ulterior purposes of the Christian dispensation? Why should the version be deemed inferior to the original when the original itself, without that version, would have been utterly unintelligible and thus incompetent to bring about the final purposes of the Jewish economy? The force of this reasoning would be at once apparent if we suppose for a moment that the Septuagint had never existed. The Hebrew language would then have ceased to be vernacular several hundred years before the Christian era, but no Greek version could have aided to supply its place. In that case, the Jews would have wandered far and wide over the east and west, but they would have had no scriptures to remind them of their patriarchs and prophets. It must have all depended on unwritten traditions and on dubious historical reminiscences, so it's all reliant on the oral, the verbal, and historical memories, right, or reflections. In the fullness of time, the era of Christianity would have arrived, but where would have been the people awaiting its advent and preparing to welcome its tidings? The gospel is preached in Judea by Christ and the evangelists in a native dialect, and various references are made to Moses and the prophets to prove that the great prophet had come into the world. But how were they to verify these allegations when they could not consult the Hebrew text? The apostles travelled into Asia Minor and Greece, and they published the same tidings in the Greek tongue. But who are to be their hearers? Who are to be the hearers? The Jews? They had no intelligible scriptures in their hands. The Gentiles, to whom such Hebrew Greek on this hypothesis would have been equally unintelligible? The New Testament was subsequently composed in this peculiar Greek, with all its references to the Old Testament exclusively directed to the Hebrew. Who is there able to read and interpret it? Or who then is there able to read and interpret it at that particular time? The Syro-Chaldaic dialect passes away, or it's confined to the knowledge of a few. How then are the tidings of the gospel to be proclaimed to the heathen world? Versions, no doubt, after a while would be made of the Old Testament, both Greek and Latin, but of what authority would they be, either to Christians or to unbelievers? Being made subsequently to the coming of Christ, they could not be adduced as any evidence of his divine mission, and as taken from a language which none but the Jews understood, their fidelity must have entirely depended on such translators as Aquila or Theodotion. But it is useless to pursue the supposition. It is evident that by the sole want of the Septuagint, the entire progress of Christianity would have been arrested, and all its evidences obscured and darkened. And the writer goes on to say the version of the LXX has influenced all other versions from the italic of the 1st century down to the latest attempt to carry the tidings of the gospel to some barbarous tribe. But by its psalter it has furnished the instrument of praise and thanksgiving to every people, and so forth. The fallacy of supposing that we can gain a more accurate knowledge of the scriptures from the exclusive study of the Hebrew than from a collation of the Hebrew with the LXX is so monstrous that it scarcely deserves an answer. Who that knows anything of the difficulties and obscurities of the Hebrew text is not rejoiced to lay hold of assistance like that provided by the Alexandrian version? To insist on the exclusive inspiration of the Hebrew text is to insist on that of which no man can form any conception as it relates to himself. Is doubt or difficulty or uncertainty inspiration? About 700 before the Christian era, the 10 tribes. About 700 before the Christian era, the 10 tribes of Israel were carried captive into Assyria and Media, from whence they never returned to their native land. Then the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. 2 Kings 17:18. The king of Assyria sent colonies to take possession of Samaria, and the remnant of the Israelites became incorporated with these foreigners and acquired their language, which is probably the Syriac. Secondly, that about a century after the destruction of Israel, we may date the commencement of the Babylonian captivity. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah out of my sight, as I have removed Israel. 2 Kings 23:27. After 70 years they were permitted to return, in number about 50,000. They found the land had lain desolate. They had lost the use of their native Hebrew and acquired the language of their masters. Thirdly, that Ezra applied himself diligently some time after the return, AC 460, to correct the canon of the scriptures. During this long captivity they were in much danger of losing the knowledge of their canon, nay, even their original record. He succeeded, however, in restoring their public worship to something like its original purity. But the fact to be kept in view is this: the pure and biblical Hebrew was no longer vernacular. It was not even intelligible to the people at large without Syriac targums. Hence, the canonical books after the captivity are considerably mixed with Syriac and Chaldee. The scripture history closes about the year AC 430. For our knowledge of Jewish history during the next 130 years, we must consult Josephus and the apocryphal books. About the year AC 330, Alexander the Great peaceably entered Jerusalem. He soon after built Alexandria. There he placed many Jews, to whom he granted numerous privileges and immunities. It was about this period the Jews of the dispersion began to Hellenize, i.e. to adopt the Greek language, and to become conversant with Grecian manners and opinions. From this brief sketch it will appear not only that the pure and genuine Hebrew of the ancient scriptures had ceased to be vernacular, but that everything which had hitherto kept the Jews a separate and distinct people was fast passing away and dissolving into the more general purposes of the Christian dispensation. It was during this critical period of the Jewish polity, AC 250 to 280, that it seemed good to Almighty wisdom to bring about the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Jewish or Hellenistic Greek. The Alexandrian Jews besought Ptolemy to send for authentic manuscripts from Jerusalem, and every motive of policy, of ambition and of literary renown conspired to render him favourable to their request. The language of our own Bible translators on this subject is so beautiful and appropriate that the author of this book should need no apology for the following extracts from their preface. And he goes through that. While God would be known only in Jacob and have his name great in Israel and in none other place, while the dew lay on Gideon's fleece only, and all the earth besides was dry. Then for one and the same people which spake all of them the language of Canaan, that is Hebrew, one and the same original in Hebrew, was sufficient. But when the fullness of time drew near, that the Son of Righteousness, the Son of God, should come into the world, whom God ordained to be a reconciliation through faith in his blood, not of the Jew only, but also of the Greek, yea, all of them that were scattered abroad, then lo, it pleased the Lord to stir up the spirit of a Greek prince, Greek for deceit and language, even of Ptolemy, Philadelphus, king of Egypt, to procure the translating of the book of God out of Hebrew into Greek. This is the translation of the 70 Interpreters, commonly so called, which prepared the way for our Saviour among the Gentiles by written preaching, as St. John the Baptist did among the Jews by vocal. For the Grecians, being desirous of learning, would not want to suffer books of worth to lie moulding in kings' libraries, but had many of their servants ready scribes to copy them out, and so they were dispersed and made common. Again, the Greek tongue was well known and made familiar to most inhabitants in Asia, by reason of the conquests that there the Grecians had made, and as also by the colonies which thither they had sent. For the same causes also it was well understood in many places of Europe, and also Africa too. Therefore the word of God being set forth in Greek became hereby like a candle set upon a candlestick, etc., etc. It is unnecessary to enter into any minute account of the circumstances attending this Greek translation. As to the narrative of Aristeas, it is now generally supposed, or at the time was generally supposed, the forgery of some Hellenistic Jews who were desirous of magnifying the reputation of this version in the eyes of their Palestine brethren. But when every deduction had been made for what was fabulous, it left a deep conviction that this translation came abroad with some strong marks and attestations of its providential origin, and that it was received with profound veneration by those for whose advantage it was more immediately designed. What could be more worthy of almighty wisdom than to select such Hellenistic Jews to become the translators of Moses and the prophets on behalf of themselves and of all the nations of the earth? What more conducive to the advent of Christianity? What more confirmatory of its evidence to the end of time than to make Jewish elders the heralds of the Messiah and Jewish interpreters the commentators to the Gentiles? Such were the Egyptian Jews of Alexandria, who had mingled largely with the Macedonian armies, and whose descendants form a considerable portion of the commercial population. It was to attach these colonists to his throne and government that Ptolemy Philadelphus encouraged a design which, under Providence, was intended for the subsequent benefit of the universal church to the end of the world. So were these Jews part of the Grecian army, as well as in the commercial population. The court of Ptolemy was distinguished for its patronage of learning and elegant literature. Alexandria could boast of one of the largest libraries. The name of Demetrius, Phalereus, Lycophron, Theocritus, Aratus, Nicander, Apollonius, Callimachus, and several other distinguished writers were amongst the ornaments and contemporaries of this celebrated era. The style and phraseology of the Jewish translation correspond to that which is now understood by the term Hellenistic, whilst considerably influenced by what is peculiar to Macedonian Greek. It has blended also the Alexandrian terminations with those Hebraic forms which cannot fail largely to enter into any version of scriptures made by Jews, entertaining the highest veneration of the original text. See the two learned sermons of Bishop Maltby, Preached before the University of Durham, London, 1843.